Good afternoon and welcome back to early modern Europe. Today we are going to be looking at the English Civil Wars. And yes, that's plural for a reason. One of the things that we're going to discover is that over the course of studying this particular period of time in English history, that this is a collection of conflicts as opposed to one major conflict. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but it's important for us to set the stage that way because for England during the 17th century, so we're smack in the middle of the 1600s, this is a time of significant change. They are emerging onto the Atlantic world as an actual player. And that's going to shape how they're going to be doing things. They've been playing catch up in many ways for Portugal and Spain, especially, even a little bit of France and the Netherlands or the Dutch. But it's in the 17th century when England really starts to emerge from all of that clutter and that static. But the English Civil Wars are going to consume their attention because they're going to be working out exactly who's in charge. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the nuts and bolts of the English Civil Wars, see what the conflict is specifically about, and look at some conclusions that we can draw from it, and as we can understand England and the rest of continental Europe moving forward. It's also very important to note from the very beginning that because England goes through the civil wars, it does in the 17th century, it will not be consumed by the revolutionary fervor that we're going to see in the French Revolution and on through the rest of the 19th century. Yes, they're going to have that little problem with their colonists in North America. But that's really less an internal revolution and something different, which we'll get to when we get to that point. So let's begin with our exploration of the English Civil Wars. And in many ways, this starts in 1603. And it starts in 1603 because that's the year that Queen Elizabeth dies. And that wouldn't have been a problem had Queen Elizabeth actually had an heir, or at least named an heir, somebody who would succeed her on the throne. Queen Elizabeth did not do that. She did not have a living blood relative that she had named as an heir. And so this really was the end of the Tudor dynasty. And so what we're going to get out of all of this is not so much a messy scramble for succession, because by the time that Queen Elizabeth died, it was fairly well understood that Mary Stuart's son, she was the Mary Queen of Scots, it was her son, King James VI of Scotland, who will very likely take over the throne of England as well. And so that's where we begin. We begin with an uneasy succession, but not a messy one. More so than that, though, is just the difference between Elizabeth on one hand and James on the other. Elizabeth was larger than life, the head of England as it was emerging onto the Atlantic world stage. Somebody who had weathered a series of crises and made it out on the other end as one of the most formidable queens of all of European history. Not simply for statecraft and politics, but also for art and religion and dealing with this thing in England called Parliament. And that's really where the story begins. And this is where the story is going to find us following throughout the whole thing, is this relationship between the monarch of England on one side and Parliament. Parliament being essentially its legislative body. Parliament is made up of two chambers: the House of Lords, aristocrats, right? Landed estate holders, all the rest. Big titles, go a long way back. Some of them will even say they trace their lineage all the way back to William the Conqueror in the 11th century. So the House of Lords. And on the other side, the House of Commons. Not significantly different in its makeup of our Senate and our House of Representatives. That's kind of where we got the idea. Not that we wanted a landed estate being in charge of the House of Lords or the Senate, but these are longer-term thinkers. That was the idea. Whereas the House of Commons was definitely more attuned to the needs of the common people, the everyday folks, and especially the burgeoning middle class. And so between Parliament and monarch, they were constantly in a push and pull between who is in charge. Now, the monarch was always in charge. There was no doubt about who was in charge, especially with Queen Elizabeth I. But she knew how to play the game. She knew her politics particularly well. She knew the issues of palace intrigue. She was smart, savvy, careful, thoughtful. She knew how to put the right people in the right places. That cannot be said in the same way for James. James VI of Scotland, King of Scotland. He became King of Scotland at the ripe old age of 1. Yeah, 1 year old. That's when his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had to abdicate the throne. And for a long time, throughout most of his growing up years, he knew the trappings of power. But not in England, Scotland. And it's a little bit different. The scope is different. The size is different. The religion, even at the time, was different. England had come through the Reformation just as everybody else, but Scotland had moved and traveled more towards Calvinism than England. England was the Church of England. It tried to chart a middle course between Lutheranism on one side and Roman Catholicism on the other. And there's always the push and pull between the poles of what it meant to be a Protestant in England. Well, in Scotland, the Presbyterians, right, who had a different style of governance, which we'll talk about in a little bit, were definitely far more attuned to Calvinism and its strict moralism and the emergence of what we will call Puritans. People who looked at what the Church of England had done and said, you didn't go nearly far enough, and who were appalled at the worldliness of Elizabeth, at the way in which she embraced the stage and people like Shakespeare. To the Puritans, that was just abominable, right? The stage was nothing but deceit and the work of the devil. And so they were against it. They were against anything like that. They were against gaming, gambling, drinking. The Puritans were trying to find that hardcore kind of ascetic, rigorous approach to Christianity. And that was far closer to the Calvinists. And so James I grew up with that kind of Presbyterian background. Now, he was married to a Catholic, and so there was still that pull, But make no mistake about it, James was different, more austere, more moralistic, more rigorous in his approach to religion. For Elizabeth, religion had always been vital, but not pressing. But she wore the title as the head of the church well and effectively. And so here we have it. We're with James as he becomes now King James I, King of England and King of Scotland. And this begins the unfolding crisis and the catastrophe of the English Civil Wars. Now, before we dive into it, there are three phases to the Civil Wars. And in many ways, you can see why we use the plural when we talk about these three phases. And so the first is the moderate phase. And that lasts from 1603, when Charles becomes king, to 1641, when things really start falling apart. The second phase is the radical phase. And this is 1641 to 1660. Historians will actually argue that it is between 1641 and 1660 that we really should talk about multiple civil wars, because there really is a bit of a series of conflicts. There's 1641 to 1648, 1649, then 1648 to 1649, right? Gets dodgy, and then the rest. All right, so there's the radical phase. And then finally, what we might want to call either the counter-revolution or, if we wanted to be even more specific, perhaps, we would talk about the Restoration. But restoration has always been one of those words that I found a little much, simply for the fact that, well, what they say they have restored isn't fully restored in that way. Like I said, we'll get there. We'll get there. And so we begin. We begin with James I. And there he is in all of his 17th century glory. James I, King of England from 1603 to 1625. James was a true believer in the divine right of kings and in an absolute monarch. And that's really the most important point to start with this whole story. Because I had mentioned, this is a fight between monarch and parliament, right? They're trying to figure out who's in charge and how much they are in charge and how this is going to be governing. This guy, James I, was an absolute believer that what the king said goes, period. That's the way it works. He was an absolutist. A king should have absolute power to govern in the way that they want to govern. And so he didn't really worry all that much about what Parliament thought or what Parliament articulated. And he really didn't think at all about the attitudes and the ideas of the common people. I mean, honestly, why would he from his perspective? Now, the divine right of kings is a fairly straightforward political concept. It is the belief that the king derives their power, the monarch derives their power and their authority from God. And we've talked about this already when we've been talking about Marsilius de Padua and the Defensor Pacis. And that's really an important point, because Marsilius was arguing, no, the divine right of kings really doesn't, that power flows to the people give that power up to the king. And what the divine right of kings is, no, it's a direct line. God whispers into the ear of the monarch and says, "You're king." And that's it. Just like that, right? And because it was God that gave you this divine right of rule and of governance, of authority, if anybody was actually to challenge your authority as sovereign lord of the realm, they were actually challenging God, which is a neat way of making sure that nobody challenges your authority. If somebody challenges your authority, you're blaspheming. Not only are you working against the state, you're working against God. See how this works? It's a great system of governance if you're the one in charge. And so James was an absolute believer in this notion of the divine right of kings. The problem is that he still had a parliament, and parliament, at least going, a few hundred years back, firmly believed and had the ability to pump the brakes on what a monarch wanted to do in England. They had control of the power of taxation. If the king wanted revenues raised, he had to go to Parliament and ask them to do it. And James had none of the skill in dealing with Parliament that was a hallmark of Queen Elizabeth's reign. He didn't know how to work with him that well, frankly. He was not a good politician. And by that I mean, he didn't know how to move or encourage or convince the members of Parliament to do what he wanted them to do. He just really wasn't that talented at it. If you plan on governing, you need to be a good politician. It's not simply about throwing your weight around. It's not simply about saying, this is going to happen and I want it done by fiat, meaning I just want it to happen. Well, in this kind of system, you got to convince people to do the things that you want them to do. You have to impress upon them the importance of your policies and all of this kind of good stuff. We've made politician into a dirty word. And we really need to be careful to understand that in order to govern, you need to be a good politician, because a politician is simply somebody who does the business of the polis, the community of the governed. That's what a polis is. Go back to the ancient Greeks. It's the city-state, right? You got to run it. Politics is by nature a human activity because we are social creatures. We live in community, and that community needs to be governed. That business of doing the governance of human societies is called politics. And so you'd like to think that your people are going to be good at it, or at least recognize that they have to do it at all. And sometimes James was like, I just want you to do what I want you to do. And that's going to be a problem. Because Parliament had already decided and had already cultivated the reality that they got a say in all of this. This goes all the way back to the very kind of crucial beginnings with the Magna Carta, when the Lord said, hey, you, king, no, you actually have to listen to us every now and then, right? And that's all that was. That was just trying to get them to get the monarch to understand that they're not in this by themselves, that this whole business of an absolutist form of governance doesn't really work. You can try, but it's not going to last. Which is why I think we always look at the French Revolution, because the French Revolution held on to absolutism for so long that it came to the point where something was going to just snap. right? And we'll get to that. As you can see, we're continuing to put those pieces into place as we build up to that kind of event. England was always fundamentally different from that because of the institution of this thing we call Parliament, which is, by its very nature, more democratic. Small d, right? Democratic. Because more people are involved. Even the House of Lords. But definitely the House of Lords and the House of Commons, that adds a lot of people that you've got to try to convince to do the thing that you want them to do. James didn't want to have to do that. He wanted to be an absolute monarch. I say it, therefore it's going to happen. Period. And so he acts like that in many ways. He runs up the national debt through extravagance, right? And he really resented the need to ask Parliament for money at all, for anything that he wanted to do. Be it the stuff he wanted to spend internally or domestically, or the stuff he wanted to spend on his own family, or the stuff that he wanted to do overseas. And so he picked fights with Parliament over the power of the purse. He picked fights over religion. He drove a foreign policy that was wildly unpopular with the majority of his English supporters because he always kind of winked and nodded at the Spanish monarchy. And see, and that's going to be a problem as we go along, is that the monarchs had a tendency to intermarry, right? You can only marry like to like. And so you've got to marry people within your own class. Well, your class as a king is pretty small. And so you start to look to other people in Europe who are on that same level. It's good for alliances, it's good for economics, it's good for everything, but it's also something that just has to do with the fact that they just believed that nobody else was good enough for them. Well, that means you start to think about people in your class as more close to being kin than your own country people. You start to think other monarchs and other aristocrats are more important than your nation. That's really going to be a problem. Because once you start to make a preferential statement about people who are in your class and not in your country, what are the people of your country going to think? Where do they think your allegiance lies? With them or with the others in that very small club? That's a danger to the monarch and to the nation. King James was not Queen Elizabeth. And it built resentment with the people in Parliament. And that's going to be a problem as we go forward. Because, well, his son, Charles I, who will become king upon his father's death in 1625. Well, let's just say that Charles seems to have adopted all of his father's worst traits. All of them. Right? I mean, we're kind of going from picture to picture, right, with all these lovely images. There's James, a little bit more austere. Charles didn't have that same austerity. Little bit more flamboyant. But he definitely agreed with his dad on a number of really important things. The first was absolutism. Charles actually made James seem like a Democrat, small d Democrat, comparatively, in many ways. James would at least recognize that he had to drag himself to Parliament and get those people to do what he needed after a while. Charles really, really hated to consult with Parliament at all. It bothered him to no end, because he was also absolutely convinced of the divine right of kings. Why do I need to continue to go begging to those people who are not ordained by God? Why do I need to go to those people to do what I want to do? And he hated it. He just hated going to Parliament. And definitely only called them into order when he needed to ask for money. Well, it's going to change in 1628. In 1628, the Parliament has frankly been getting fed up with their kings as of late. James was a bother. Charles is even worse. And so they said, look, this is what we need to do. You, king, remember, you work with us. Parliament is a part of the English Constitution. Get used to it. And so in 1628, they passed what was called the Petition of Rights. And it called for some fairly straightforward and absolutely understandable reforms to what was going on in English society at the moment. Right? First, they said a king, a monarch, could not jail people without good reason. You're thinking, wait, that wasn't on the books? Right? Because remember, absolutism, divine right of kings. A king could essentially say, okay, off to the Tower of London with you for no good reason. And frankly, people were getting sick of that kind of power being exercised. You want to jail somebody? Okay, make your case. What's your evidence? Why is this person getting thrown into prison? Right? And no, you can't just say, I don't like them, or they said something against the crown, or against God, or explain yourselves, right? Shouldn't be that complicated. So that's the first one. Second, the king could not make any tax without Parliament's approval. And that has always been the unwritten rule. And pretty much everybody had abided by that, even James I. And Charles is like, no, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to start imposing taxes. And he did. He tried to impose taxes without getting Parliament's approval. And then Parliament's like, you really can't do that. Because if we don't do this, then what do we have Parliament for? And that's probably what Charles was thinking. I don't want to have Parliament. You guys all need to go. And they're like, not going to be the way this works, right? The king could not proclaim taxation without Parliament's approval. Last, the king could not keep soldiers in people's homes and could not use the army to maintain order during peacetime. The army doesn't belong to the king. The army belongs to the country. Now, even at that time, they were still using essentially local militias, right? They did not have a standing army. They did not have a professional army at this time. They had militias that you called up into service. And you had people who would lead them into service. And those few professionals, they kept their hand in it, and most of them were part of the aristocracy or members of Parliament. But for the most part, they didn't have. And so they were essentially, you can't use the army as your own personal goon squad. They don't work for you. Does this sound familiar? Do you see where this is kind of going? Do you see why the English colonists in this new place called the Americas might have some concerns? I mean, let's be honest, it's an interesting thing. Even in our Bill of Rights, the Quartering Act, or the, no quartering of soldiers in people's homes. Do you know why it is that you shouldn't be able to quarter soldiers in people's homes without their permission? Because you put a soldier in somebody's home and they are, in this particular case, the king's representative in that home, which means they are now a coercive presence in that home. Because if you say anything against the king's representative's sitting right there. And the king's representative can then say, oh, wait a minute, that you shouldn't have said. And you're like, well, you wouldn't have known if you weren't sitting in my house. So no quartering of soldiers. That's been something that goes all the way back, right? And so Parliament says, Petition of Rights, 1628, we'd like these things. And to which Charles responded by refusing to seat another Parliament for 11 years. He's like, oh, that's very nice. That's a lot of fun. Okay, Parliament, not going to seat you for a long time. Because, see, the monarch of England is the one who officially seats Parliament. They call for elections and you get new members of Parliament and you put them into place, right? And then the monarch opens the show, and he just refused to do it for 11 years. This is not a small issue. This isn't just a monarch having a fit of pique. This was a hammer blow against the very way that England had been doing business for a very long time. Charles just didn't think that he needed Parliament to do what he needed to do. And this is going to precipitate the crisis. This is going to be the thing that pushes them closer and closer to a civil war. The question was, were there enough people on the Parliament side who would support them against the king's increasingly absolutist demands? And obviously, the very fact that we're going to be talking about a series of civil wars, the answer to that question is, yeah, there were a lot of people. But see, here's the thing. People in England had been building towards this kind of cooperative venture of governance for a long time, for centuries by this point. And they had hit some of the highest peaks of their nation's history under Elizabeth, who was able to work with Parliament. And in fact, encouraged that. Now, let's be honest, she was a monarch like anybody else. She wanted her say, and she threw her weight around. But she also knew how to govern, and she was a good politician. And people had gotten used to that. They'd gotten used to people who knew what they were doing and how to play the game. And how to include and convince and inspire the people to follow. A leader can't just be somebody who tries to throw their weight around. They need to be able to encourage people to do good, whatever that good is defined as. It's important. And so, here we've got it. Tensions are rising between Parliament and King, and soon both sides have supporters lining up behind them. Right? Charles, being king, is going to have the royalists and the cavaliers. These are essentially the troops on his side and the people on his side, the ones who would fight tooth and nail for the monarchy. And shockingly enough, you're going to see a lot of aristocrats on that side of the aisle. On the other side are the supporters of Parliament, and these are often called Roundheads, and this is a good example of them, right? The Roundheads, so nicknamed by the royalists, frankly, it was an epithet, it was an insult, right? They were called Roundheads because they wore their hair very closely cropped, very cut short, right? As opposed to either the long ringlets of the aristocracy or even the wigs that they wore. These were the supporters of the constitutional or the parliamentary monarchy. They tended to be middle class and many of the lower classes, but a lot of the middle class. And this is something that I think is particularly important to understand, is that most revolutions come from the middle class, not the lowest classes. Lowest classes tend to get their rebellions put down. Revolutions have a tendency to emerge from the middle class. People who know that they should have more power than they do, but know that they're being blocked from exercising that power. People who understand that things should be a little bit more even, a little bit more equitable, that such a small number of people shouldn't hold on to so much power and authority. And so they push, and they push, and they push for reform, and they get to the point where those reforms no longer seem to be working because they keep hitting that ceiling of the aristocracy and the monarchs and their attitudes. The middle class, generally speaking, are often the agents of change. They have just enough power and just enough awareness to realize that it shouldn't be like this. And so the parliamentary forces, especially in the House of Commons, who are representing, these are not the poorest of the poor. They're representing the middle class, the upper middle class, the people who have educations, the people who have means, but not spectacular, and they know what they don't have. And they know how they're getting blocked. And so the forces coalesce. Now, on top of this all is something that you can probably guess. This is not just about parliament and monarch, parliament and king. This is not just about how much power the various classes have, right? So it's not just economic. It's not just political. You think, oh, here it comes. Yep, there's a religious component to this as well. Because remember, in the English Reformation, you have the Church of England, and they tried to find a way between Luther's reforms and the Roman Catholic Church. And so if you walked into an Anglican worship service, you would say, this is like Roman Catholicism. And the answer to that would be yes. Just with a different focus of theology, and you had gotten rid of the Pope and the cardinals, but you still have the ranks of clergy. You still have the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the titular head of the church. The monarch of England is really the head of the church. And so there's that interweaving and all of that. But it looks a lot like Roman Catholicism without the guilt, right? Or the Pope. Right? And some theological conversations that are distinct. But that's not the only religion. That's not the only version of Protestantism that is circulating around the British Isles. As I mentioned before, you've got a good dollop of Calvinism working through the Scottish Presbyterian Church, which by this point has pretty much taken over in Scotland. And that fight between Calvinism on one side and Anglicanism on the other side, that's really one of the more important pieces to this particular puzzle. It's not the whole story. Make no mistake about it. We're definitely talking about politics, economics, and religion. It's a mix of all of those three. But Charles wanted uniformity in many ways. And so he knew that throughout the whole of his broad kingdom, he needed to start getting people back under his unified sway, especially as the head of the church, which meant being the head of the Anglican Church, right? And so he wanted to get people back in line. And you want people with some kind of uniform religious observance simply because it just makes your life as monarch that much easier, especially because, generally speaking, that's what he believed, right? You've got the Presbyterians up in Scotland, and you now have these things called Puritans. Puritans were the people in England who looked at the Church of England and said, you know, those reforms that you undertook, you didn't go nearly far enough. Not far enough. You still smell like Rome, as it were. You still look like Rome. You still do so many of the things that feel like Roman Catholicism, and they wanted a clean, complete, utter break. It all had to go. Not just the hierarchy, but the kind of the pomp and circumstance of the whole thing. The sacraments, the statues, the iconography, right? The fancy clothes, the over-the-top liturgies from their perspective. It all had to go. They wanted a stripped-down Calvinist approach to religion. The Puritans, if they're influenced by anybody, and they are, it's Calvin and the Presbyterians. If the Church of England is separated, you've got the Anglicans, the Church of England on one side, and the Puritans on the other. A way of thinking about that, this is what we would call High Church. And these can be described in theological and liturgical ways. And Puritans are Low Church. And this is both governance and ceremony and a good bit of theology. But there's the big break. And so the Puritans in England are essentially saying that the Church of England didn't go far enough in its Reformation. They need to make a clean break with Rome once and for all. Even Romish, as they called it, Romish practices. And so what you've got here is another aspect of the crisis that is emerging, because in 1637, right, 1637, Charles I is going to impose on Scotland a Scottish version of what is called the Book of Common Prayer. This is not just a prayer book, right? It's not just a hymnal. This is essentially the theological framework and source of the ideas of the Anglican Church. If you want to get a really good sense of Anglican theology, look at the Book of Common Prayer, which was essentially developed during the Reformation by the people working around King Henry VIII. Right? All right, so Charles wants to impose a Scottish version of the Book of Common Prayer on the Scots, right? The Scots did not react well to this at all. The Scots reacted by condemning the prayer book and abolishing the governance system that was used by the Church of England. Because the Church of England used the Episcopal church governance, right? And so I want to talk about that for just a moment. You're thinking, why do we always keep getting dragged back into religion? Well, because that's the period that we're studying. You cannot talk about this period without talking about its theological Donnybrooks. Just the way it is, right? All right. And in this one, it's really important. But as you can see, there's something really important. And there's something very consistent about the fight that we're seeing. Because on one side, the Church of England had what we call Episcopal Governance, right? So Episcopal means simply bishops. All right. Scotland wanted to have a Presbyterian governance. Well, a presbyter, which is the root of this, is the old word for priest, or in what the Presbyterians and the Puritans would call a minister, somebody who serves. The bishop, their functional role in the early church, which is where we get the word episkopos from, was oversight. They were in charge of all of the local priests or parish clergy, right? And the governance was essentially kind of top down after a while. That's what the church adopted, right? Pope, cardinals, bishops. And so they served as a typical hierarchical structure. We've talked about this before, but it's really important in this particular context. All right. The Presbyterian church is like, no to that, right? No bishops, essentially, or at least the people who are going to be in positions of oversight do not have additional authority. These guys had loads of authority, and generally speaking, were upper class. Oftentimes, especially in England, aristocracy themselves, because that's how they got picked to be bishop, because they were already in positions of power. Well, the Scots wanted a Presbyterian church governance, meaning that they were going to be essentially governed by elders and deacons. It's more democratic in one way, or anti-clerical in another way of thinking about it. They didn't want to be charged or governed by the elite. They wanted to govern themselves. And so the Scots, who were having this Book of Common Prayer forced on them, reacted spectacularly negative to all of that. They condemned the prayer book, they abolish episcopal governance in the church, and they adopt the Presbyterian church governance. And in many ways, essentially what they've just done in the Church of Scotland is to say to the bishops who were members of the aristocracy, you're out. The ministers will do this. And the elders of all of the congregations, essentially church councils at the local level. Right? Now, some of these words, they got to start coming back to you a little bit from things that we've talked about. And the ideas that we've talked about throughout this, between the divergence of a kind of an absolute form of government and governance wherever it is, and a more democratizing ideal. Now, I'm not saying this is good guys and bad guys. I'm simply saying that this is a divergent path for how you want to govern and how you want to be governed. And Charles forcing this issue does not do himself any favors. And frankly, it drives a huge wedge between himself and his father's original kingdom, Scotland, right? His dad was born in Edinburgh. And so Charles sees that, well, that didn't work. And then he realizes that Scotland is essentially gearing up. They are getting their army up and running. They are fortifying. They are making sure that their weapons, the whole thing. And he realizes that he may have really stepped into it. And so he does what he's needed to do for a very long time. In April of 1640, Charles calls Parliament back. He seats a new Parliament. Why? One reason only, and that is it's time to raise money for an army, because he knows the Scots are going to be a problem very soon. So he calls for elections, members of Parliament are elected and seated, and of course, Parliament, who has been stewing the last 11 years because they're completely out of power, are spectacularly not thrilled with Charles. And Charles, of course, once the Parliament is seated, continues his, well, dodgy attitude about Parliament in general. And so Parliament, realizing that Charles really needed them more than they needed him, because that undercurrent of discontent had been bubbling for 11 years, and the people of England were starting to think, maybe, kings, what a pain. And so Parliament says, great, we are in a good political situation, so let's ask for reforms before we say anything about your additional taxation. Give us a little bit and we'll give you the cash that you want to protect us from the Scots. Seems like a perfect idea, except for the fact that Charles hated it. Hated it. Of course he hated it. He's an absolutist, right? He's a monarchist, first, second, and last. The last thing he wants to do is to allow Parliament to gouge more power and authority away from him. And so he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And he dissolves Parliament 3 weeks after they are seated. 3 weeks. It's called a short Parliament in history, right? They were seated for a whole 3 weeks, maybe a few days more, and that's that. Which didn't help matters in Scotland at all, because what happens next, right? The Scots look at this and go, oh my goodness, look what he's just done to his own Parliament. And so the Scottish Parliament declares, right, with all grave solemnity, that they can now govern without the king's consent. And so Charles has managed to do this wrong every step along the way. He knew the religious contentions between the Church of England and the Presbyterians, and he forced the Book of Common Prayer on the Scots anyway. They rebelled against that. They started building up their armies, and he's got to go back to Parliament, and he's got to say, I need some help. The Scots are getting a little out of hand. And they're like, okay, we'll give you a little help if you help us out first. And he's like, no, that's not going to happen. And they're like, fine. Not that they could do anything about it because he dissolved Parliament. And the Scots are like, oh, we see exactly what you're doing. Yep. So we can govern without your consent because, frankly, you're never going to give us consent to do the things that we're going to do. And so the Scots not only say that, the Scottish Parliament says, yeah, we're moving forward without you, King. They move their army into Northumberland, which is northern England. Beautiful territory, by the way. I've hiked across that part of England a couple of times. It's just gorgeous, right? But the Northerners are a distinctly different bunch. They're a little bit more sometimes closely attuned to the Scots than they are the rest of England. So the Scots moved their armies into northern England as a show of force, and by 1640, the fall of 1640, they've taken Newcastle, the major port city of northern England. That's not an insignificant thing. They've grabbed Newcastle upon Tyne. which is its full official city name. Charles is like, whoa, what just happened? And everybody's like, well, it's really not that complicated. You're an idiot. And you managed to manufacture this crisis all by yourself. Congratulations. So Charles is now forced to seat a new parliament in the fall of 1640. And in October of 1640, the new parliament is called, and they are actually going to be seated until 1660. And so following on the heels of the 3-week short parliament, we're now going to get a nearly 20-year-long long parliament. And the vast majority of those who win election for the House of Commons are members of Parliament who are vehemently opposed to the king. And so not only is the Parliament back, they're more radical than they've ever been before. And how do we know this? Well, the Long Parliament, one of the first things that they do is they start hearings to impeach most of the king's counselors for high treason. Oh, oops. Right? The back and forth over the movement of these hearings lasts well into 1641. And now things are really starting to deteriorate. The king is frustrated. The Parliament can smell blood in the water. And so, in late 1641, Parliament put forward what is called the Grand Remonstrance. The Grand Remonstrance is a list of 204 objections against the king. "204 different critiques of what the king has done, how the king has acted. 204 ways of calling for reform. And one of the first things the Grand Remonstrance does is it calls for the expulsion of all the bishops from Parliament. They have to go first. In late 1641, Parliament puts its foot down and calls for a series of spectacular reforms and critiques of the king. And while I will never say that something is inevitable, by this point, civil war is spectacularly probable. Throughout the rest of 1641 into the early part of 1642, most of the cities around England start strengthening their defenses and digging in and getting their militias up and ready for action. Now it's just a matter of time, really. By the summer of 1642, the entire city of London is in open rebellion against the king. The largest city in the kingdom, the most diverse population, the largest number of the middle and upper middle class, the people with business interests around the Atlantic world, and a desire to grow further and to have more say in how their government is going to function. The people of London rebel against the king first. and the rebellions start to sweep through the southern part of England. The king has strongholds in northern England. And we see the lines start to harden. The first major battle is the Battle of Edge Hill. In 1642, October. Charles, leading his own troops, because kings still did that at this time, right? Kind of an important thing. I'd like to go back to that, just because. You want to get us into a conflict, you stand out there in front of the troops. Just a thought. I think it would squelch a lot of military conflict in the world today. And not just the United States. I don't care who the president is at any given time. You want to lead us into war, you lead us into war. Get out there, friend. And everybody else around the world needs to do the same thing, right? I don't care who it is. You want to get us into a conflict, you get out there. Just that's my my suggestion for all of this. So Charles is marching with his troops towards London, knowing that if he's going to squash this rebellion, he's going to have to get to London and squash it there. That's the only way this is going to work. And so Edge Hill is on the way toward London. And when the battle finally erupts, what's interesting and what is revealed in all of this is that while the king's forces were strong, they were not as overpowering as he thought. And in fact, he was slowed considerably, had to be diverted into other small towns. And by the time he was able to get anywhere close to London, the parliamentary forces had been able to fortify London, and they completely stalled Charles' advance. This is important because what Edge Hill showed more than anything is that Charles was not going to be able to just stop this thing in its tracks at the very beginning. This was going to be something that was going to drag on. And any time a king is trying to put down a rebellion, the longer it goes on, the nastier it's going to be, and the more problems are going to erupt. He couldn't take back his biggest city. And it wasn't even really that close, right? The parliamentary forces showed that they had the ability to fight Charles and the royalists to a standstill. And so while the Battle of Edge Hill wasn't conclusive in and of itself, it showed that this was going to last for a while. And the longer it lasted, the more war-weary the people, the more they were going to start to look for exits. But that's down the road. The next battle is at Marston Moore. In July of 1644. And I know there's a lot of lists of battles and dates, but don't worry so much about the details and worry about the flow of this particular conflict. You see, by the summer of 1644, Charles was playing defense in the north, where he did not think he was going to have to play defense. He thought that he had that area pretty well locked down, but with his royalist forces not seemingly finding a lot of safe havens, he was now even feeling himself besieged in the great northern city of York. Again, one of my favorite places to go. York's amazing. while the forces were being besieged at York, they decided to, and this is the old kind of conflict, they decided to take this fight over to Marston Moore, which is about 7 miles away. Nice wide open area for a good battle, right? Let's solve it out there on the battlefield. It was a spectacular, grotesque fight, right? As most of these battles in early modern Europe are, because we're not dealing just with pikes and swords and cavalry and all the rest. We've got early musketmen and pikes and artillery. And none of that early gunpowder weaponry was particularly accurate or particularly tidy. It was a mess, right? You're getting hit by a blob of hot lead. Most people didn't die from the wounds, they died from the infection of the wounds or from bleeding out. And you're thinking, awesome, Dr. Grant. So glad I watched this right before dinner. I'm just saying, warfare at that time was a messy, ghastly business. But then again, warfare always has been. There's nothing ever tidy or clean or heroic about the whole thing. It's just war. The battle was joined in earnest when parliamentary cavalry forces, led by a young member of parliament named Oliver Cromwell, who you'll probably have heard of before and who we'll talk about a little bit later. Oliver Cromwell's cavalry troop crushed the royalist cavalry on the right wing. Cromwell, and then seeing the parliamentary forces were getting hammered over on the left flank, swung around behind the royalist forces and put them to rout. Cromwell's tactics won the day, and his forces mopped up. Why is this important? One battle amongst many? Because at Marston Moore, for the very first time, the Royalists suffered an absolute and utter defeat in the war. It wasn't even close. They got blown off the field, which does a lot for the psychology of warfare. One, the Royalists are all of a sudden realizing, holy cow, we're not unbeatable. And not only did they lose, they lost big. And the parliamentary forces, especially under the command of that particular cavalry troop by Oliver Cromwell, were like, oh, we can outthink these guys. We know that there are ways to do this. Because see, in warfare, as with anything, there's strategy and then there's tactics. Strategy is your overall vision. Tactics are how you get there. The specific nuts and bolts, things that you do to work out your grand strategic vision. Cromwell was a spectacular tactician. He knew how to move troops and use them in the right places, right? People often will confuse strategy and tactics, and you need to be able to be good at both, or know how to put people who are good in those very specific things into place, right? Some people can see the big picture. You need those, but you need the nuts and bolts, bean counters, and tacticians as well. You got to have them both. Cromwell was a spectacular military tactician. He wasn't very good at politics, though he'll give it a try, because that involved strategy and a bigger vision. Well, in this particular case, though, at Marston Moore, the Royalists suffered a massive defeat, and that did not help, right? And so, later in 1644, Cromwell and others in the parliamentary forces realize that they need to be able to capitalize on their victories in the field to both help themselves with continued victories in the field, but also just generally speaking. And so in late 1644, Parliament is going to pass an ordinance, and it's called the Self-Denying Ordinance. This is going to state nice and clearly that all members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords who held a military commission, i.e. were officers in the military, they had to either resign their commission or their place in Parliament. You couldn't be both a military officer and a member of Parliament. You had to choose one or the other. Thinking, why is that? Well, very simply and very straightforwardly is that they knew in the parliamentary forces that many of the officers were parts of the aristocracy, those who weren't completely loyal to Charles, right? Because there were some, good number of folks in the House of Lords who were aristocrats, and even some folks in the House of Commons who had titles and all the rest. And so they said, here's a problem though. As aristocrats, you really don't have a great keen sense of experience on the battlefield or strategy and battle tactics. It leaves you woefully unprepared for leading modern forces into battle. And additionally, right? So there's the practical side of it is that these guys simply didn't have enough experience. And they weren't tacticians. They weren't even good strategists. They were aristocrats. They were landed elite. They lived lives of comfort more often than not, right? It's not like earlier on in the Middle Ages when they fought regularly. A lot of practice, right? But additionally, the bigger problem was, as aristocrats, they had a tendency to sympathize with their fellow aristocrats who were royalists, right? And they definitely, they're, again, it's like and like. It's the 1% saying to the 1% around the world, hey, you're more with us than we are, Americans or Germans or Chinese or anything else, right? They had more in common because of their class. And so they have a tendency to do a couple of things. They would say, oh, okay, no, that's good. We won, and let the people on the battlefield bugger off before their forces could essentially capture them. Or they would just not work that hard. Didn't give it their all. Oh, because they didn't want to upset the other side because they weren't the other side. They were them. They were all in the aristocratic class together. And so they're like, you guys have to make a decision. You either want to govern or you can be in the military, right? So make your choice, right? The other thing is that these aristocratic military types really didn't understand that in the social classes beneath them, when they were thinking about political reform, they weren't limiting it to much of just reform. They were itching for something bigger, more transformative, more revolution than evolution. They really didn't understand that folks farther down the socioeconomic ladder from them had a desire for more radical change. There were factions in the parliamentary group called the Diggers, who definitely wanted more egalitarianism, or the Levelers. And I'm sure you can probably figure out who the Levelers were. They wanted to level everybody to the same level. Thus the name, not complicated. And so these aristocratic members of Parliament and these you know, they just couldn't grasp what it was that the middle class and the lower middle class were really agitating for. And Parliament's like, well, we want to push as far as we can possibly push, and you may be holding us back. And so the aristocratic members of Parliament would cool the rhetoric, slow walk the reforms, especially once the forces were in the field. And so the self-denying ordinance really was structured to encourage all of them to give up their military commissions, which was a part of a broader strategic view of the military itself. See, Cromwell and another member of Parliament, a guy named Sir William Waller, knew that they really needed to overhaul the military completely. It needed a complete restore, revision, reimagining. And so they put forth something called the New Model Army. This was going to make the army more easier to field, easier to move around the entire country, easier to pay for, easier to train, and all of the rest. Because what they were going to do is that the members of Parliament decided that soldiers would be a part of a full-time paid professional army, as opposed to these less reliable part-time militias. So, full-time and paid. They would be a national force, which would solve the problem of these local militias, because a lot of the local militiamen didn't want to travel too far from home, right? Because if you're just a part-time soldier, right, you don't want to go too far from home, because that's where work is, right? You go fight in the field, on the field of battle, and then you go home and do your work. And that was also by having a full-time professional army, you would get better soldiers out of it. B, they would have better morale, because they're not always thinking about wanting to go home, because they're actually getting paid for this, so they don't have to worry about their income levels and all the rest. You see how this works? It's very, very straightforward, very convenient. And so they created a series of military organizations that were going to provide the best bang for their buck and the best kind of force in the field for the new style of military conflict. So they would have cavalry, they had mounted infantry, called the dragoons, right? Foot soldiers, which were musketmen and pikemen, artillery, and then logistics. You would train them, you would pay them, they would be professional, they would be experienced. Oh, and to make sure that they all had one identity, you dress them all in red uniforms, or at least in red coats. And this is where we get the origin of the British red coat. They wore those uniforms to be distinctive in the field, and because they would be easier to be seen. You can spot your guys in red jackets. And so strategy and then tactics especially are so much easier. But it also, by giving them a common uniform that's distinctive, it also helps to shape their identity. And of course, the last bit of the New Model Army was to convince the aristocrats to give up their commissions, which they were encouraged to do rather strenuously. All right, so now you've got your New Model Army in the field, and you take it out for a test run at the Battle of Nasby. In 1645. Parliament's New Model Army scores a decisive victory at Nasby. So decisive that within a year of this, in 1646, King Charles I actually turns himself over to the Scottish forces that are under Parliament's control. Notice he didn't give himself over to the parliamentary forces. He gave himself over to the Scottish forces because he knew he could probably talk his way out of that. So the war's over. At least the first one is, in 1646. And what occurs after this, after the Battle of Nasby, and after King Charles realizes that he's in a world of hurt and gives himself up to the Scots, we get a discussion in Parliament that's called the Putney Debates. And the Putney Debates ask some really important and fundamental questions. The first is, what should be done with the king? Right? What do you do with the king now? And they argued about it. Some said he just needs to be kicked off the throne and maybe we'll get a better one. Some of them were like, maybe we should do something a little bit more final. And everybody's like, oh, that seems a little extreme. Right? They asked, what should we be done with the lords? Right? The aristocrats, generally speaking, have been on the wrong side of this fight. What should we do with them? In the House of Lords, they're in Parliament right there. What should we do with Parliament itself? And the big question in the Putney Debates, who should participate in the government? And this wasn't just between the royalists and the parliamentarians, right, or the Parliament folks. You also would get the diggers and the levelers and all this. It was a massive conversation. And during this time when they're not fighting, the interbellum, right, between the wars, while Parliament is debating how they should proceed, Charles, shockingly enough, escapes custody. Who could have seen that coming, right? He escapes custody and begins marshaling his forces in Scotland. Oh, it just does his, dear departed father's, Scottish heritage good, right? The Scots are backing Charles and a good number of the aristocrats who helped him do all of this. He begins marshaling his forces in Scotland, and in 1648, he launches an invasion of England. You think, well, he's got the wind at his back, right? Parliament's been debating. Maybe they're not sure what to do. Maybe they're not sure how to go forward with all of this. Maybe they're really, kind of torn about this. Well, they put the New Model Army into the field, and it really doesn't take the parliamentary forces of the New Model Army very long to stop Charles and the Scots. They march north, they stop Charles, and they grab him this time, and they bring him with them this time, and they march back down to London. And all the time they're marching back down to London, the Parliament's, I don't know, what do we do with the king? What are we going to do? How is this going to work? And they dither about this. And the army, led by Cromwell now, rolls into London and says, tell you what we're going to do. The first thing they do is they purge all of the members of Parliament who had ever even remotely been royalist in their leanings. They're out. And even those that they're a little bit not sure about, they just bar them from re-entering Parliament at all. And so they bring in the people that they know that are actually devoted to the Parliament cause, and there's only 75 of them out of a few hundred. And they set up in Parliament's chamber this rump Parliament, right? The leftover bit of Parliament. There's 75 of them. They set up a high court of justice to try King Charles for high treason. They put their king on trial for treason. Treason is a capital offense. If he is convicted, Well, he is. And look close at this image. On January 30th, 1649, Parliament beheads their king. It's the first time that a major nation state has executed their own sovereign because he acted against the interests of the people and the Parliament. They killed their king after a trial because their king had committed treason. Woof, right? How does a country come back from killing their king? A lot of people felt immediately guilty about it, but a lot of them were like, it had to happen. He was getting so extreme. He was getting so out there. He was so moving beyond the bounds of what we had said was acceptable behavior by our sovereigns. Somebody had to stop him. And the second, as we might call it, of the English Civil Wars comes to an end. His son, Charles II, who was a youth at this time, was exiled. And they created what was called the Commonwealth of England. It was led by Oliver Cromwell, one of their most decorated soldiers and members of Parliament. From 1653 to 1658, Cromwell led England as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Essentially, he was a military dictator. And remember how I said that Cromwell was a great tactician? He was. He was a lousy politician. He was not a good strategist. And in those 5 years, he instigated wars. He wrecked the economy. And then once he finally died, he named his son as his replacement. His son lasted 1 year. And that was frankly longer than he should have lasted. Cromwell's actions prompted a backlash against his leadership, against a military dictatorship, and finally, the monarchy was restored. And it's an interesting thing because the monarch was only restored by the consent of Parliament. Right? By the consent of Parliament, the king was restored, and it solidified England as a parliamentary monarchy. What we get out of England as we move forward, the results, as it were, is Parliament's rights and its authority were definitely established. The king was not absolute. The monarch was not absolute. They may have even agreed with a divine right, but that divine right also included Parliament. And make no mistake about that. One of the other results, though, that we see, Cromwell was a Puritan. So were many in the leadership in Parliament. And so Puritan influence on English society is going to explode at this point and in this time. not fully, not completely overwhelming the Church of England, but being a twin force in religion in the British Isles. But make no mistake, even as they exported Puritanism, it's strict, rigorous, no fun, excessive, individualistic version of the faith. They also exported this notion of parliamentary governance. And that is going to secure them from that point forward in their kingdom and later their empire. Because from this point, England only grows in strength and influence. Economically, religiously, politically. And they will be a power throughout the Atlantic world and throughout the world for a long time to come, for good and for great ill. Their colonialists and their colonialism will be one of the great stains on English history. But it starts with the decision to balance the power of an absolute monarch and to say, monarch, yes. Absolute, no way. And that's how they move forward. And it's an important component of our continuing story of this whole term. Thanks so much for sticking with this lecture today. It has been an absolute hoot. I love working my way through the English Civil Wars, and yes, plural. So thanks, and I look forward to seeing you for our next lecture. See you next time.